Good evening. I am Rica Estrada, Officer in Charge of the CCP Visual Arts and Museum Division. Welcome and thank you for tuning in to What Might Matter, Materiality and Immateriality in Artists' Online Presence, an online curators dialogue with Kenneth Paranada and Marian Roces. The discussion today will tackle ideas such as the notion of an artistic community, post-pandemic realities, transnational biographical arcs, re-emergent right, and the re-emergent right in an unstable world, among others. Following the previous 21 a.m. public program with Pio Abad and Norberto Roldan held last June that asked about the role of art today, Paranada and Roces plan to look to these contemporary concepts to explore what might matter in our world today as we live with altered realities of cyberspace and the visceralities of politics. Our two speakers today are of different generations, localities, and backgrounds, and it's our pleasure to have them both with us today. John Kenneth Paranada is a London-based independent curator, writer, and researcher. His curatorial practice is geared towards developing critical cultural forms, environmental consciousness, community-engaged projects, and platforming marginalized narratives. His interdisciplinary approach focuses on experimental futures, decolonial art, and new media technologies. He was a curator in many exhibitions, including exhibitions at the New Museum, New York, in partnership with Nanyang Technological University's Center for Contemporary Art, Singapore, the National University of Singapore Museum, as well as in the Shanghai Biennale, among others. Ken has also served as guest curator of 21 AM's ongoing exhibition, the collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders, Jewelry and Augmented Reality by Pio Abad and Francis Wadsworth Jones. Let's all welcome Ken. Hello.
Hello, everyone.
Our other speaker today, Ms. Marian Roces, is an independent curator, critic, and is the principal founder of Tao Inc. She's also founding director of think tank Brain Trust Inc., which, among other policy documents, authored the Mindanao 2020 Peace and Development Plan. She has also curated multiple exhibitions and released numerous publications, of which you can read about. Among those, or most recently, her ongoing work includes supporting and writing for a website she helped develop at the School of African and Asian Studies at the University of London called Mapping Philippine Material Culture Overseas, which gives online access to globally dispersed material. Her next book is on the murderous rampages of the Ilaga, or Christian militias in the 1960s to 1970s in Mindanao. She has been involved in counter-disinformation projects for half a decade. She was also the curator of the CCP's Museo ng Kalinangang Pilipino and was commissioned to redevelop the museum with Tao Inc., which has brought us 21 AM today. Welcome, Marian.
Hello, I'm really happy to be here, and I'm happy Ken is here.
Let's begin. The floor is yours, Marian and Ken.
Hello, good morning or good afternoon, wherever you are on earth. I'm Marian Roces. I'm really happy to be here with Ken, mainly because it was wonderful working with him on the inaugural exhibition of 21 AM, which we developed with Rika, who is our host this afternoon. But there's another reason why I'm totally enjoying conversations with Ken, and it's because it truly is cross-generational. Every time we talk to each other, we do have differences of opinion that are actually rooted in the fact that I'm older and he's younger. And so I think some of that will come out during this conversation. Let me begin with the topic that brings us together, or the human being that brings us together. It's actually Pio Abad and his wife, Frances Wadsworth Jones, whose exhibition is ongoing as the inaugural exhibition at 21 AM. And I would like to begin this conversation by saying right away that Pio was not an obvious choice, but that Ken and I both thought that he would be wonderful for a number of reasons, primarily being the fact that he is so absolutely and viscerally embedded in politics in the Philippines. And I underline visceral because it's in the gut. On the other hand, his context, his cultural context is really transnational. He actually does not live in the Philippines, and his peers, his colleagues, his allies his co-travelers, so to speak, are not from the Philippines. They do live in many parts of the world. It's very interesting for an artist of such political power and obsession, shall we put it, does not live in the country, nor did he grow up professionally and artistically with other political artists in the Philippines. So you can say that the word community comes to play right away. What has been Pio Abad's community? You can name the artists who emerged in the 21st century, Wali Drad, for instance, or Rabim Rue or Shirin Nishat. This would actually be a large milieu. And so it brings to mind, therefore, why or how the word community might be playing differently today, especially because 21 AM does have to drive home the point that it is digital, that this is an immaterial medium. And so, Ken, would you like to kind of jump in at this point?
Right. Thank you for the invitation, Marian. What an honor. I've always been a big fan of your curatorial practice and always been inspired by the conversations that we had throughout, like, I guess, 15 years now. Can you imagine? But
Yes.
jumping into this idea of community, there are different ways of approaching this, but my initial understanding of this term was grounded on Benedict Anderson's Imagine Communities reflection on the origin and spread of nationalism from a social science vantage point when I was studying Philippine studies in 2005. But obviously, in the core insight I got from reading Benedict Anderson is the concept of the nation has no basis in empirical reality, but instead is purely political innovation that is constructed based on this idea of a shared identity. His core insight is the concept of a nation has no basis in empirical reality, but is instead a purely political innovation that constructs a shared identity, binding strangers from different communities together, usually on the basis of a shared language, history, culture, religion, or ethnicity. And so it goes into this deference to ancestral worship and how that kind of developed into a national consciousness. And then from that national consciousness, how that became transnational. And so I think Pio's selection was also based on this sort of like understanding of the complexity of, you know, nationhood, or probably the complexities of transnationalism and geopolitical complexities.
All right, I'll jump in, Ken. To just say that, of course, I didn't think to begin with Benedict Anderson, of course, mainly because nation is important. Of course, it's underwrite. It will always be the elephant in the room in this conversation, especially because of the nature of Pio's and Francis's work. But I'm just wondering whether we could probe a little bit, Ken, beyond the seminar on the history of the word nation. Benedict Anderson puts it down to Latin America at a particular point in time. And there's a lot to be said about that. There's a lot vis-a-vis the Philippines to be said about that. However, let's just go take community. Community is uttered often in art, in politics, in economics, with NGOs, with it's said every day of our lives. And so in particular, I would like to point out that community is used by the NGO community, by civil society, including their benefactors like the World Bank, for example, or the Asian Development Bank, it's a very curious word because it has replaced old words like masa and lumpen, or in Taglish, sa ground, mga tao sa ground, or grassroots even. It's actually replaced it in the general discussion, in popular discussion. let me just, I suppose, give you a sentence about what I think about this understanding, this constant usage, and it is that in the Philippines, the word community is a linguistic gesture towards a pro-people morality. So when you say community, you're not just saying community, you're actually gesturing or projecting your morality, your pro-people morality. It actually telegraphs the speaker's populism. And that leads into the art world at a time in the 1990s and well into the early 20th century, 21st century, where where there was a gravitational shift to what's still called cultural democracy. So just those are really just the parenthetical statements from my part, just so that we know that that word community is what most Filipinos will understand by the word community. But I'd like to probe, Ken, your practice now as a curator in an international context, in a cosmopolitan context, where that register of the word community is not the one that is being used. So have a go
Right.
at it, Ken.
Yes, totally. Because like the complication in the terminology kind of like creates different interpretations of it. But when I was like studying contemporary curating and obviously these ideas of like visual culture, I've encountered this concept of social sculptures. And obviously this was like inspired by the Fluxus movement, a movement in the West, obviously, but it kind of like changed how I kind of understand the word or like the term community. Because social sculptures is basically works of art that emphasizes interactivity and dialogical relations between people with objects rather than the purely visual or aesthetic. So this idea, I think, radically got expanded in the 90s by kind of like, I guess, curators, critics such as Nicolas Boileau and his idea of relational aesthetics, the idea of an art practice that seeks to dissent against the swollen commodification of art as a luxury brand in the era of the neoliberal globalization. So art started becoming immaterial, ephemeral, and I guess more social, and like the materiality of art started becoming gestural, becoming more performative, becoming more action-based with communities. What do you think about that, Marian? Is that sort of like
I'm going to have to do a generational thing on you. So I'd like to say, wait, immateriality, the discursive immateriality of art didn't begin with Boya. It was actually conceptualism of the 1970s, obviously.
yes.
That was the main shift into the immaterial, in a sense, the regime of the idea. But I understand that you're actually talking about a totally different thing, and it's removed by about 30 years. So let's just say that Joseph Kosuth did not involve the viewer in his art ideas, for example, in the 1970s. But Rikrit, the Thai artist, does, because the Thai artist, Rikrit, I'm sorry, I can hardly pronounce his name, so please forgive me for not giving his family name. But I'd like to point out that when he cooks Thai food in a gallery, there is what is now called interactivity. That didn't happen in the 1970s, even if they were both talking about art as not vested in an object. All right. Now, Guya's idea is also, again, this is probably generational. It does not appeal to me because it is apolitical. It actually affects a non-political view of art. And those of us who grew up in the 1970s, we were rather committed to the idea that all art is political, especially conceptualism and any number of genres that you might want to think about. So Bourdieu's idea of immateriality vis-a-vis the art market and vis-a-vis exhibitionary traditions, I'd have to say I'm uninspired by him. But then this is really just in passing. So, do you see that this generational differentiation might be of interest to you? Do you find it a bit rich as a topic of conversation?
I think so, because it's very discursive in terms of like, I guess, having that trans historical understanding of ideas and visuality. But I think what attracts me to Bourdieu's idea is how it's in principle trying to speculate a language and gestalt of modernities to come. A modernity that he claimed is actually very specific to the 21st century. And so I guess I'm attracted towards understanding how this forms becomes interfaces. And that interface becomes into a particular image that we know will obviously be kind of like, again, affecting consciousness in a scale that we cannot know for now.
Yes, well, that part I really understand what you're getting at. And it is very 21st century. You do have to have a brain and a life that's fully engaged in the 21st century with everything that's going on right now in order to appreciate what you're talking about. And there's really a thread that I'd like to pull on from what you're talking about to other writers that are of moment at this time. And it's that recognition that art has to be seen in relational ways. And that's very big in what you're talking about, that it does not reside in an object. It could reside in the meeting of the maker of the artwork and the person who sees or encounters the artwork, that it resides in the intersection of their relation. So it's not object focused, and that's a major shift as we move from the 1970s to the 1990s into the 21st century. And you can see that in the work of Pio and Frances, right? It had shifted into a relationship with a country, with an imagined community. But it is immaterial and it can emanate from London. It can emanate from wherever he is. The important part of it is that there's somebody out there who's online who sees and encounters what he's talking about. That didn't used to happen before. And so I understand why the conceptualists of the 1970s were really, even if they were moving away from the object, they were not moving away from having a viewer view. Today, the viewer is regarded as part of the relationship that creates art. So yeah, we're not so different. I'm just looking at it from another perspective. Anything you'd like to add, or would you like to shift to another writer?
Right. In relation to that idea of, Pio and Frances' work and its kind of like relationality, this echoes Edouard Glissant's idea of poetics of relations. Edouard Glissant is this French Caribbean,
Yes.
I think from Martinique, and created this whole movement in the 80s, the Creolite movement. And, Glissant defines his poetic of relation both as aesthetic and political, as a transformative mode of history capable of summoning concrete multiforms, these entanglements that Pio and Frances are talking about in terms of a particular system that is geopolitical, that is basically residing in a particular language that is constantly in dialogue, let's say. So in Glissant's view, we come to see that relations in all its senses, storytelling, listening, connecting, and the parallel consciousness of self and surrounding is the key to transforming mentalities and reshaping society. So I guess this leads us back to Pio and Francis's critical work, the collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders, because it generates not just one meaning, but it's always many and endlessly open, which is like for me very poetic.
Well, when you involve people in the making of the artwork, in the making of the meaning of the artwork, when they are actually not just an audience, I mean, we have to get rid of the idea of audience now. We do have to get rid of the idea of a viewership or the art public, because the encounter itself is what is productive of art. Now, Glissant is actually really more to my liking, not just because he's a poet, uh, and how I wish I could read him in his apparently beautiful French, but the idea of réalité is, I think, of vast importance to people like us in the Philippines who are living in an archipelago and who are at the crossroads of incredible forces of such magnitude, that you really do have to look at yourself as islands being taken up by storms and surges, storm surges. And it's not a pretty picture of coconut trees and beautiful islands. It's a picture of dangerous and devastating forces that link up and that throw their weight on islands. Now, Glissant is like that. He actually understands that dynamic, and his poetics of relations, which is really, really important, is a way in, especially for people like Filipinos, to understand that our cultural context, our transformational context, we are constantly being transformed, and we are constantly transforming ourselves based on our own will and based on our own determinations. But those old ideas of authenticity and those old ideas of even preservation and harking back to the past, and what culture is as some kind of singularity, these are all going to be blown away by cataclysm. And Glissant is a way in to actually see the poetics of transformation, very violent transformations, but also transformations in which you can exercise your will. And surely you don't need to teach Filipinos such a thing. So you're nodding your head. I don't know whether you like my liking the archipelagic, but I do like Caribbean writers very much indeed.
Totally, I agree. Like the parallelism in terms of like how the Philippines is also an archipelago, and all of these kinds of like ideas bleed into sort of like each other because of, I guess, like the habitus or like the environment that we live in, and like the colonial experiences that you know, everyone has encountered in some ways or form. I guess we're gonna sort of like, we can also look at all of this communities and its kind of terminologies in Bruno Latour's understanding of it, which is
Bruno.
basically, you know,
Right.
another kind of like universe that is kind of like, I guess, interesting to dabble into, since Latour posits that we need to see everything, including animals and inanimate objects, not just human beings, as a community, but other agents in that intricate network that make up the world, biological and live. And so I guess Latour is pointing at a particular notion or reinvention and another radical expansion of the word community, because, you know, communities can sort of exist from a smaller subset of communities and all of these kinds of complications.
Well, I'll pick up Glissant again before we full on go into Latour, who is one of my favorites, of course, and in one of the people that I had to think about in curating the establishment of 21 AM, to be perfectly honest. But the idea of relationships, relations, capital R, relation, that we exist within relations, that not only art exists within relations, but um, not only human experience exists in relations. And we already picked that up a little bit in Glissant, who is actually pointing to non-human the agency in relational contexts. So now when you go into Latour, it's not quite poetic, it's extremely it's about networks. So actor network theory, ANT, without, well, you've read ANT. And the only thing that I think is necessary for our very brief conversation this afternoon is to press the idea that thinking in terms of networks, Glissant relations, Latour networks. All right. And the networks don't include only human beings. The networks includes animals, the networks includes plants, and the networks, this is my favorite, it includes objects with agency. And the assignation of agency to objects is quite important, because we cannot, we simply cannot construe or understand the architectures of cyberspace, nor participate in its becoming without understanding that that object, that artificial intelligence is an agent, is an agency. And it is an agency that, well, sooner rather than later, is going to be probably the smartest agencies around, much more than human beings. And so when you're really looking at networks now as not your bodied experience, so now we're back to materiality and immateriality, it's not bodied anymore. Does it make it less political? Therefore, if you're now looking at yourself as parts of networks, have we abstracted ourselves so that we look at ourselves like a computer does, which is a node in a piece of digital architecture? I'd like to actually press you to talk to that point, Ken.
Right, those nodes I think are very important, because once it is interlinked, it either regenerates or probably kind of like creates a new system. And this is like the beauty of like projects such as like Pio and Francis's work, is that it constantly creates a new node whenever someone kind of like is interested with it. You know, like the idea that it can be interpreted in generative ways rather than just like telling you what to do with it. And so I think in that kind of like network and nodes and rhizomes, it creates all of these complicated webs. And those webs...
You just put in Deleuze and Guattari. All right, well, rhizomes, well, all of these have a long tap roots, of course. And so curatorially, in our practices as curators, it simply is important to understand I used to say the human condition. I used to say that all the way until the end of the 20th century.
Don't you use that term anymore, the human condition?
I do not use that word, that term anymore, nor do I use the word community like NGOs use it at all. Because the question that I pose to myself now is, granted the recognition that objects are have agency, there's a huge literature on that, you know that. And granted that plants and animals have agency and that we are all interlinked. And the idea is to understand the interlinkage. In Glissant's word, the relation. In Glissant's imagination, the poetics of the relationship. In Bruno Latour, it's to understand ecosystemically. Now, is it so disembodied now? I don't think so. And I am actually hoping that this will be understood by people who fly into and jump into cyberspace, as we invite people to do in 21 AM. because it is the apocalypse. We have 10 years. Climate change is going to do us in. If we do not think ecosystemically, if we don't understand the networks, if we don't find that delight and that joy, that poetics of things that are crashing all around us, we are doomed. And it seems to me that art um, is rather privileged still. It's always been a privileged modality of action. The curation is a privileged modality of activism. But it is important to understand that all of these philosophical wanderings and the pressing home of what it is, what matters, what should matter. What should matter is that we understand how networks come together and how networks erode, how networks disentangle themselves, because otherwise you can't even have your politics of your community. You can't. You're going to have your typhoons and your floodings and etc. You're going to have tyrants ruling over you. You're going to have disinformation if you don't understand this interconnectivity. And so I sound like a prophet of doom. But that again is where I began with you before we began this conversation online. It's just I am actually utterly apocalyptic, whereas you're not. And therefore you should have the last say because you're younger. So could I invite you
I think that perspective is relatively healthy, you know, and that criticality and that sort of like sort of doom and
yes.
jaggedness, I think, is like it sharpens the question of what it means to be kind of like in a larger kind of expanded notion of community, right? It's also sort of expanding our understanding of where to situate this notion of hope in all of this kinds of like hopelessness.
Yeah,
Let's say.
where do you locate hope? Therefore, what community? In which community do you locate hope? I'm struggling with it, but you're younger, and I actually am wanting to learn from you.
I think it's a matter of putting everything in perspective. And as you posit earlier, it's this understanding of how networks actually function in particular societies and how these communities are formed and how all of these ideas are kind of like always grounded on a particular idea of power relations. It's always grounded on a particular idea of agency and manufacturing that agency. And so I think curatorial practice and the visual kind of like cultures needs to be constantly be monitored or probably studied, because these are like the powerful weapons that a lot of governments are using to actually enslave a particular idea into people in the 21st century. Technology has become very dangerous.
So are you saying, therefore, that you do arrogate to art, unto art, a particular role as if we might use a very old term, speaking to power? Are you suggesting that that role that art might actually occupy still?
I think so. I mean, has it actually sort of like escaped it? I'm not sure, because like every kind of like image or an idea or conceptual whatever has always a signification, a meaning kind of derived from just like the pleasure of understanding it from a vantage point of, a dialectical imagination with an object, or probably now on a screen, or now via sort of like all this multi-sensorial forms of contemporary art.
Well,
so but what do you think about like, is it kind of like reflected as well in the larger vision of 21 AM in terms of like tackling the immateriality of art? Will it venture in NFTs?
Like I said, I'm going to give you the last word in this conversation, but I'm actually drawn back to Pio and Frances and how they made the digital version of the jewelry. And I'm always going back to the idea that it's very hard to do. It's very hard to render digitally incredible jewelry. They have millions of facets, and it really is hard work to digitize such. I mean, it is. These are objects that. What is the word for it? These are objects of such violence, and to create a digital version of them for people online to play with. Um, I am going to actually grant that that is a delusion line of flight, that that might actually be a hopeful trajectory. Um, I do not want to live without hope, but I think we need rigor. And when we start thinking ecosystemically, or in Latour's terms, in networks, or in Glissant's terms, in relationships, I think Frances and Leo's work is a superb example of very hard politics, very visceral, very material politics. It's in his body, and by association in Frances's body. It is deeply embodied, but it is deeply immaterial. And so this is the 21st century. I mean, it actually captured that sort of like moment in time when materiality and immateriality may matter as fused together, and as an inaugural exhibition for an online museum. It was brilliant. Thank you for helping realize it, for curating.
Thank you for the invitation.
All right, so your turn now. Give us hope, please.
I think
being
hope
specious.
is usually sort of found when everything is, kind of like not the way it is or the way that you imagine it, and hope arises
Okay.
from all of these hardships and from all of this political upheavals, right? And so I think the younger generation is taking up the mantle of activism inherited from obviously the likes of you, Marian, and sort of like, Alice Guillermo and all of this like people who kind of posited for I guess like an understanding of the complexity of like Filipino culture from a perspective that not just is insular, but actually very outward looking. And again, going back to Glissant and those types of relationships, I think there is hope in those things because we look at ourselves from a vantage point that is kind of outside of us, and that's for me generative and mind expanding.
I don't want to be the last word, but yes, thank you.
Thank you, Marian and Ken, and to all our viewers today. So maybe with that, we can take a few points like the value in intergenerational dialogues and learnings. Also, how we can learn from art history and our peers that came before us, and also how we can find hope in the future with our peers today, and also that with the notion of hope, that hope should come with rigor and criticality. So our online dialogue today is the second public program of our 21 AM exhibition, The Collection of Jane Ryan and William Saunders, Jewelry in Augmented Reality by Pio Abad and Francis Wadsworth Jones. We'd like to invite everyone to visit 21 AM at 21am.culturalcenter.gov.ph to view the exhibition and to check out the other features of 21 AM as well. And finally, for more updates and future announcements of the CCP Visual Arts and Museum Division, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.